Mamdani wins the Democratic primary and the New York City mayoral race, will likely be the next mayor of New York City. And so Mamdani was unique. He was a member of Democratic Socialists of America. He was a socialist candidate. But more importantly, he was the only candidate running in the Democratic primary that did not pledge his support for Israel. I think it's interesting. Before we get into that, I just really want to say just how interesting it was that like the front runner of this race before Zohran Mamdani won was Andrew Cuomo. I just that's just amazing. But not more so. Isn't it crazy that both Unite here and the SEIU in New York were both endorsing Andrew Cuomo over Zohran Mamdani until he won? Yeah, total establishment. I heard a rumor they're going to switch that. They're switching that up right now. But it's just like, holy crap. Isn't it crazy the front runner was a literal criminal, right? It's just so crazy that he was so far ahead in all these projected polls before his loss, right? It's just so crazy when you think of that this guy, Andrew Cuomo, he resigned his governorship of New York in disgrace. Modern charges of corruption, sexual harassment, like, holy shit, Then we see these New York City mayoral debates, and I'll be real. I didn't watch the debates. I didn't watch these debates. I didn't do any research. The only bit I looked, I saw one clip. I saw one clip where all the candidates were asked where they would visit if they got elected. Odd question to ask a mayor of a city. And all of them said Israel, except for Zohran Mamdani. And he was immediately ripped apart by the moderators and the other candidates as an anti-Semite. It's ridiculous. But it also shows how wrapped up the Israeli lobby has all of our established politicians are. They're totally wrapped up in the Israeli lobby. And so, the U.S. definitely controls Israel, but the Israel lobby definitely controls U.S. Congress. Unfortunately for the American ruling class, they don't really need U.S. Congress, so AIPAC can have it. But I also think it really shows like why, grassroots efforts are so sorely needed right now, because these establishment politicians, they really don't care. They don't care enough to actually talk to people and investigate these social issues. They just throw in with a special interest group that will fund their campaign, and they're going to read their approved briefs with all the accepted talking points, and they just do a job like an actor or a DMV employee. But when people do the work to bring people together around reasonable ideas, people show up and put work in, And so Mamdani, despite all this slander, despite all this corporate backing, going to the other guy, to Andrew Cuomo, he won the Democratic primary in a blue state. This demonstrates that even most of the Democratic primary voters in the New York City are not rabid Zionists. That's positive. It's not that positive. When we look at the power structure in New York City, the entire establishment is vehemently Zionist. And those opposed to Zionism are not nearly as powerful and organized, even if they do make up a majority of the electorate. And so, I think this is an important thing. We need to all be looking into this and try to oppose all this Zionist slander that's going against Zohran Mamdani. But we also need to be very clear that political change is not going to come from an electoral race. Like Mamdani is still liberal, SOC Dem, liberal Dem socialist. The elections of these types of people have been a welcome change, but doesn't significantly shift things for anyone except, the people who win these offices. Obviously, everything from Mamdani's totally changed overnight, but I don't know if New York is going to change overnight in the next couple of years due to his tenure. Actually, I do know it's not going to. There's going to be some things that are going to hopefully be positive, but he's going to receive a tremendous amount of pushback, and hopefully he's going to be able to finish his term. But I think it goes back to the fact it's only like an organized class that we can really use to keep these officials accountable. We can't just rely on these individual personalities to stay accountable on the platform they ran on. I think you mentioned it before, Dale, but I think AOC, is such a great example. This former left-wing darling that was a part of the squad, during Trump's first term, and he's consistently flip-flop on every issue they stood for, from most glaring being Palestine. But in terms of policy issues, like things like workers' rights, she joined the majority to legalize the railroad workers' strike just a couple years ago. She sent money for weapons to Israel, and so, and apparently, and some people are talking about her as being like a presidential candidate, like people really just don't fucking get it. Or maybe they do get it and that's just what they're okay with. That's okay too. Or it's not okay, but, I accept it. And so we have to understand this, that ultimately these liberal darlings aren't going to save us. But ultimately, you have to kind of see how they expose the system and how, like, having a grassroots campaign that has some working class elements, tries to put forward some working class politics. Let's just see how quickly this whole establishment tries to break its own rules to bury him.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Just on the AOC note, I think it's really telling when somebody's like running for office to be like, you should be able to challenge politicians in public and not just let them walk away from stuff. And then when she gets challenged on, not calling it a genocide, she's like, this is harassment. And it's like, lady, you told us we could do this here. Yeah. So don't pretend like this didn't happen before. But I mean, I think that's, you should be able to challenge politicians in public and yell at them if they do shitty stuff and go back on what they said. That's like a really basic thing. It's part of having freedom of speech, be able to speak our mind and point out when we see something that's not right. But going back to the issue at hand, I think like, the polls might say one thing, but I think like a lot of people probably underestimated just how much people in New York hate both Cuomo and hate Adams. I do think it also says something that, both parties might make a big deal about, like, oh, so-and-so being a criminal, but then go out and vote for a criminal, but that's kind of neither here nor there. And I do think, like, someone like Mamdani getting elected is a positive development in some respects. It does show, like, that people can win big races by putting progressive politics on the table, which is something that, the establishment Democrats refuse to do time and time again. Even people that go in saying that they're going to change, they refuse to really put stuff out there that's, universally going to be liked by people because they realize it's a positive development. But at the same time, I do feel like this does send the wrong message to people. There are a lot of people on social media who are saying, like, oh, he's going to lead the charge for, all these young progressive candidates to start running in the Democratic Party, and we can really change stuff this time. 7 years ago, maybe it wasn't our time, but now we can really, it's like, it's just going to make me stir crazy. Yeah. If I keep hearing this sort of narrative over and over again. And there's really only two ways that it can go. Where it's like either they hold their ground and they face so much opposition that they can't really get anything done, or they just turn right and then they work with everybody on whatever, and then just pretend they just bring up this very popular virtue signaling that a lot of politicians have. Let's be real, not just the Democrats, Republicans as well, where they say one thing, do the opposite. That's both parties. I just think it's important. Especially, because like a lot of people who support Democrats point that out with Republicans, but it's like Democrats do the same exact shit, But, I think it's something, this like rightward turn that we see from like progressive darlings running for office is something that comes up time and time again from the local level to the national level. I think locally there was somebody who ran for district supervisor in the Castro, Raphael Mandelman. He had, a lot of backing from labor. He was really like running himself out there as a progressive. He was showing up to picket lines. He was like talking to all sorts of folks. He was like bringing up his story about how his like mom was homeless. And so he like empathizes with people who are homeless and like, we're going to build a shelter in my district. And then when I get in office, a bunch of people call me and they're like, you need to call the cops on a bunch of people in tents. And then he gets pressured and he starts doing that and he starts turning and like showing his true colors, and it turns out he wasn't a progressive, and that's like, it's like, that's what we see happening time and time again. And I think like, like, especially if people running an electoral campaign isn't a part of like a principled organization, it's part of like a broader plan. Like, I don't really see how this like actually advances like putting like a working class politic forward. He might make some win some temporary gains and reforms for people who are working class. But at the same time, it doesn't build that collective power, which is really where I feel like that's where the real change happens. It doesn't just happen by people giving their power to somebody else and then just like hoping that they're going to do the best. It's not going to happen through these different legal avenues, through just like getting the right legislation with the right tax, this and that, and research and this and that. Hundreds of pages of documents, making sure everything's down to a T. That's how they want people to do it. But really what we've seen historically is the way people get shit done is they get out in the streets and they organize and they bring it to power's doorstep and they be like, you listen to us or we're going to make it a problem for you, So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think we'll see how this develops over time. I guess like on this does one last point, just on this question of like, well, is this guy a socialist? Is he really not? Said he was a member of DSA. He was sponsored by them. That doesn't mean anything. Let's be real. They're an anti-socialist organization. It says so in their national bylaws. But let's just set that aside. I think something that a lot of people would agree about is, collaborating with law enforcement is not a socialist principle. As the mayor of New York, he's going to have to work with the chief of police and the captains in every district. That's just a fact. He's just going to have to do that. And he might try to push forward some reforms, and they might be positive. But at the same time, like, this dude's going to have to work with cops. He's the head of, like, the largest, like, police force in the entire nation, like one of the largest like security networks and like surveillance networks that they have anywhere in the nation. He's gonna have his finger on that stuff. And yeah, those aren't like socialist principles. So like it could go further than that, but just at the very least, like we have to be clear about these things because he can't just like suddenly show up and be like, I'm a socialist and I'm just gonna like wave my wand and not work with police anymore. So like that's literally not gonna happen. It's not how it works.